Telltale Heart. Is it true? I'm nervous, terribly, terribly nervous, but why do you think I'm crazy? The disease sharpened my senses, but did not destroy, did not dull them. Most of all, the sense of hearing has become more acute. I heard everything that happens in heaven and on earth. I've heard a lot of things going on in hell. What kind of crazy am I? Listen and notice how sensibly, how calmly I will tell you this whole story. I cannot explain to you how this idea came into my head, but once it was born, it did not give me rest day or night. I didn't have any goals. Hate too. I loved the old man. He didn't do anything wrong to me. He never insulted me. His gold did not appeal to me. I think it was his eye that was the reason. Yes, it's the eye. One of his eyes was like a kite's pale blue, with a membrane. When he looked at me, I became completely cold, and gradually, little by little, came to the firm decision to kill the old man and thus get rid of his eye forever. So that's how it was. You think I'm crazy. Crazy people don't know what they're doing. And you should have looked at me. You should have seen how cleverly, carefully, how subtly I handled the matter. I have never been so kind to an old man as in the last week before the murder. Every midnight I turned the handle of his door and opened it, quietly, quietly. Then, opening the door far enough to let my head in, I put in first a lantern, tightly closed so that not a single ray of light came out of it, and then my head. Oh, you would laugh if you saw how cleverly I did it, quietly, quietly, so as not to wake the old man. It took me at least an hour to stick my head in completely, and see how he was lying in bed. What? How can a madman act so cleverly? Then, sticking my head in, I carefully opened the lantern, extremely carefully, because the hinge creaked, terribly carefully, and only so much that one thin beam fell on that kite's eye. I did this 7 nights in a row, each time exactly at midnight, but the eye was always closed, and I could not do my job, because it was not the old man who tormented me, but his evil eye. And every morning I boldly entered his room, talked to him briskly, affectionately inquired how he had spent the night. As you can see, he would have been extraordinarily shrewd if he suspected that I was looking at him every night at 12 o'clock. On the 8th night I opened the door even more carefully. The minute hand moves faster than my hand moved. Never before have I felt my abilities, my wit, to such an extent. I could hardly contain the feeling of triumph. Just think, I slowly opened his door, and he did not suspect about my actions, about my secret intentions. I almost laughed at the thought, and maybe he heard me because he suddenly stirred in bed. Do you think I jerked my head away no matter how? His room was as dark as a grave, because the shutters were tightly closed for fear of thieves, and I knew that he did not see me open the door, and continued to open it wider and wider. I stuck my head in and was about to open the lantern, when suddenly the hinge creaked slightly, and the old man, jumping up on the bed, shouted, "Who's there?" I stood still and did not answer. For a whole hour I stood motionless, and did not hear him go back to bed. He kept sitting on it, listening, just as I happened to sit at night. Suddenly I heard a faint groan and recognized it as a groan of mortal terror. No pain, no complaint, oh no! It was a quiet, dull sound, rising from the depths of the soul, suppressed by fear. I knew this sound well. More than once at midnight, when the whole world was asleep, it burst out of my chest, aggravating my horror with its ominous echo. I tell you, I knew that sound well. I knew how the old man felt, and I took pity on him, although my heart laughed. I knew that he had not closed his eyes since the very moment when a slight noise at the door made him stir. His fear grew all the time. He tried to convince himself that there was nothing to be afraid of, and he could not. He said to himself, "It's nothing, it's the wind rustling in the chimney, a mouse ran across the floor," or, "It was a cricket chirping, just a cricket and nothing else." Yes, he tried to comfort himself with such assumptions, but in vain. In vain, because death approached him and stood before him like a huge black shadow, and engulfed its victim. And the ominous influence of this invisible shadow made him feel, although he did not see or hear anything, to feel the presence of my head in the room. Having thus stood for a very long time and without waiting for it to settle down, I decided to open the lantern a little, by a hair's breadth. So, I began to push the door away. You can imagine how quiet, until, finally, thin, weak beam, like a thread of a web, escaped from the lantern and fell on the kite's eye. It was wide open, and rage seized me when I looked at it. I saw him quite clearly, dim, blue, with a disgusting membrane, at the sight of which trembling penetrated me to the marrow of my bones, but I could not see his face and torso, because, as if by some instinct, he directed the beam precisely at this damned place. Did I tell you that you take for madness the unusual sharpness of my feelings? Said? Well, so at that very moment I heard a quiet, deaf, frequent knock, like the ticking of a clock wrapped in cotton wool. And this sound was familiar to me. I knew it was the old man's heart beating. My rage intensified, as the courage of a soldier flares up from the drumming. But I still restrained myself and stood still. I was barely breathing. I held the lantern still. I tried to keep the beam in one place as much as possible. Meanwhile, the infernal pounding of the heart intensified. With every moment it beat faster and faster, louder and louder. The old man must have experienced unbearable horror. And louder every minute, notice? I told you that I'm nervous, yes, nervous. And this strange knock, in the dead of midnight, amid the ominous silence that reigned in this old house, aroused in me an irresistible horror. But still I restrained myself and stood quietly for a few more minutes. And the knocking got louder and louder. I thought my heart was about to burst. Immediately I was seized with anxiety. What if the neighbors hear this knock? The old man's hour has struck. With a wild howl, I opened the lantern and rushed into the room. He screamed, only once. In an instant, I pulled him to the floor, piled a heavy mattress on him. I laughed merrily when I saw that things had gone so far. But for a few more minutes, my heart was beating dully. This, however, did not bother me. I knew that they would not hear behind the wall. Finally, it quieted down. The old man was dead. I pulled off the mattress, examined the body. Yes, he was dead as a deck. I put my hand on his heart and held it like that for several minutes. No sign of life. Dead as a deck. His eye will no longer torment me. If you still consider me crazy, then, of course, you will not be convinced of this when I tell you how skillfully I hid the body of the murdered. The night was drawing to a close, and I worked hastily but without noise. I took out 3 boards from the floor and hid the corpse there. Then he laid the boards back in their original place, so carefully, so skillfully, that not a single human eye, not even his eye, would see anything suspicious here. I didn't have to wash it. There was no blood, not a speck. I was too careful for that. When I finished my work, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, but it was as dark as midnight. As soon as the clock struck, there was a knock at the outer door. I went to open the door, quite calmly. Now I had nothing to fear. 3 people came in and very politely introduced themselves as police officials. One of my neighbors heard a scream at night that aroused suspicion in him. He informed the police and they, officials, were sent to investigate. I smiled, for what was there to fear? I very kindly received gentlemen of the police. I explained to them that I myself shouted in a dream, said the old man had left town. He took them around the house, asked them to look carefully, and finally brought them to his room, showed his treasures safe and sound. In a fit of courtesy, I even brought chairs into the room and invited them to rest here, and myself, with insane audacity, in the consciousness of my triumph, put my chair in the very place where the body of my victim was hidden. The police calmed down. My appeal dispelled their suspicions. I felt the best. They sat down and we began to chat about this and that. Soon, however, I felt sick, and I would be glad if they left. My head ached, my ears rang, but they all sat and chatted. The ringing in my ears intensified, everything intensified and became clearer. I raised my voice, trying to drown out this sound, but it became louder and clearer, and finally, I was convinced that it was not in my ears. No doubt I turned terribly pale at this discovery. However, he continued to chat even more freely and louder. But the sound got louder. What was I to do? It was a low, dull, frequent sound, like the ticking of a clock wrapped in cotton wool. I was suffocating, however. The police had not yet heard him. I spoke faster, louder, but the sound got louder no matter what. I got up and started arguing about some trifles, raising my voice, gesticulating. The sound was getting louder no matter what. Why didn't they want to leave? I ran around the room, stamping my feet, as if pissed off by the policeman's words, the sound getting louder no matter what. Oh my God, what could I do? I raged, yelled, scolded. I grabbed a chair and banged it on the floor, but the sound got louder, louder, louder. And these gentlemen all laughed and chatted. Didn't they hear? Almighty God. Of course you heard. Suspected. They knew. And they were amused by my horror. I was and still am of this conviction. But anything was better than this torture, easier than this mockery. I couldn't bear their hypocritical laughter. I felt that I must either scream or die, and the sound was heard, not ceasing. Louder and louder. 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 Scoundrels, I shouted, stop pretending. I confess. Raise the planks. Here, here. It is his damned heart beating.